This is a CNIB Foundation podcast. The content in this podcast is provided for informational purposes only. It is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. CNIB does not make guarantees about the comprehensiveness or accuracy of the content. CNIB and the podcast participants assume no responsibility for how you use the information provided. If you require legal advice about a specific issue, contact a lawyer or community legal clinic.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Know Your Rights podcast. And I'm joined by Jason and Avesta today to talk about self-advocacy and what that really means. I mean, for all of us listening, watching this episode, this podcast, I think it's really an interesting topic to know what our rights are and how we can advocate for ourselves and to really take charge through education and implementation and execution of advocacy. And as some of you may know, I have a rare form of macular degeneration and am legally blind and have made it my mission and passion to help others live a purpose-driven life through self-advocacy implementation to live exactly how you want to, emotionally and physically. So without further ado, I'd like to first introduce Jason to the episode. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So Jason, you are a lawyer, a criminal lawyer with the Crown, and you also have some vision loss as well. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your experience, of the type of vision loss you have, and how you have gotten around that to be, working as a lawyer?
So yes, so I'm totally blind, and I'm a federal Crown counsel with the Public Prosecution Service of Canada. And what I do is I am a federal prosecutor and I prosecute criminal cases, namely cases involving narcotics, drugs, the sale of narcotics, trafficking in narcotics, possession of firearms, proceeds of crime, etc. I'm in court a lot. I do a lot of trial work, a lot of motions. When I'm not in court, I'm basically preparing to go to court. And I'm totally blind. And I've been doing this job for about 17 years now. I'm coming immediately out of law school. And so it's been a challenge for sure, especially being a person living with vision loss. But I think it comes down to what the theme of our topic is today, and that's self-advocacy. I think that when you're having a disability, in particular sight loss, in a field that typically has not been very accommodating for people with disabilities, and has been kind of, in the past, a closed kind of field, and one resistant to change, one does have to be kind of out there for themselves and letting everyone know that they can do the job and showing them how, and also advocating for your accommodations. For example, with my job, I have a paralegal who's specifically dedicated to assisting me. For example, we deal with a lot of police officers' notes, and they're typically handwritten, which obviously don't lend themselves well to being scanned or being read. So the person would basically type them out for me, would transcribe them for me. We're organizing very large files and very large pieces of evidence and whatnot. So having someone help me streamline that is definitely an assistance. In terms of going to court, it can be a very visual process. So I typically have, I bring typically a more junior lawyer with me, or perhaps a student. That I think is beneficial for both, is that I get the assistance I need and they get the experience. So there's workarounds, but the legal profession has been particularly a very closed field, resistant to change. That is obviously changing now, but it's taken some time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. I want to circle back to that in just a moment, but I want to also introduce Avesta to the episode and welcome her. So thank you so much for joining us. And Avesta, you have just finished law school. Is that correct?
Yes, I just graduated in April from Osgoode Hall Law School, and I just finished my license examinations with the Ontario Bar.
Wonderful. Congratulations. I know that's really exciting. My sister is just actually finished her summer placement at a firm as well. So I know how exciting that whole process is. And I believe you're starting an articling position at one of the larger firms in Toronto here. Is that correct?
That's right. It'll be at Borden Latner Gervais, LLP. And so I'm very excited for that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know how exciting that is. So congratulations. And, I think something that I'd like to know a little bit more about is I understand that you also have a visual difference. Would you mind telling our viewers a little bit about that, and then just briefly about how that has impacted your journey through law school? And I want to dive into that a little bit deeper as well. And one thing I do want to leave our viewers and listeners as a cliffhanger is I understand that you've also written a book. So if you could just give us a very quick synopsis of how that came to be, I'd be really interested. And once again, we'll dive into that a little later on in the episode.
Great. So my name is Vesta, and I'm diagnosed at the age of 8 years old with cone rod dystrophy. So what that means is I have 20 over 350 vision. That doesn't, with the diagnosis, to me, it's just a number. It doesn't explain very much. So it's not too helpful in that sense. Presenting a diagnosis when you go around. But essentially, what that means is that I have trouble seeing distance, and things can be pretty fuzzy and small, and smaller things are tougher to see. And that's definitely challenged me throughout my education and the couple different jobs I've had. It's made me become more adaptable and more resilient, and definitely more proactive throughout my life. And it was a lot of trial error. Why I particularly like this podcast about self-advocacy, because I find that working with visual impairment, a lot of it does start with knowing yourself and what you need. And so for me, a lot of my journey was figuring out my own vision and how I can best, what do I need to be accommodated and be able to do my schooling and my work. My undergraduate was in international development and globalization, and my minor was in philosophy. That was at the University of Ottawa that I finished in 2017. And that's when the idea for my book came about. I was studying a lot of philosophers, and they had a lot of different ideas about identity, but never really in the sense of people who are differently abled, but a lot of gender philosophy and race philosophy. So I thought, wouldn't this be an interesting dynamic to reevaluate what exactly it means to be differently abled, and what exactly it is to be called disabled. And that's where my idea for my book, Diffability, The Liberation of Potential, started. And so that's more of a nonfiction sort of piece where I take a lot of philosophical and linguistic theories and trying to unpack where this ideology that kind of has become a little bit of an uphill battle. I think if you're differently abled, to be able to present yourself, to show that you are able to do something, even though you do it a little bit differently. Especially, like was previously said, I'm just hopping into my legal career here, particularly all in the private sector. And those are traditionally two areas that have been a little bit more restricted for people who are differently abled. So I really want to be able to join and kind of pierce it a little bit, so that the people who come after me have a easier time, and there's more understanding and more collaboration, both in the private sector and the legal field and other fields of employment as well. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm so excited about this episode because I think both of you really embody, why we're doing this series on knowing your rights And one topic that has come up, or not so much a topic, but a point that has come up in a lot of the other episodes is this is so important for other people with visible and invisible difference to know that you're not alone. There's other people who are paving the way for change for all of us, for future generations, and to not accept intolerance, and for everyone to be as accepting and accommodating as possible, because we all deserve a personalized plan of attack, whether that's school, whether it's for applying for a job. We're all different and we all succeed in different ways. And if we can figure out the best way, and Avesta, you said that beautifully, of finding the right tools so that you have the best resources to be as successful at whatever you choose to do in your job, your life, your relationships, it doesn't matter. Finding that is so important. So I'm really, really excited to hear about that. I'm really interested to know about your book as well. But Jason, I'm just wondering, at this point, and probably our viewers and listeners are wondering, how do we kind of know what our rights are, in Canada, in Ontario? Does it vary in province to province? I'd love some insight on that from you.
It does vary from province to province. What one's rights are in Ontario may differ from British Columbia. So how to know, is there a one-stop shop other than maybe the Know Your Rights project itself? I'm not sure that there is. Obviously you can do your classic Google search, but I can't say unless you go to like a disability law clinic or go to a resource like what we're providing. There probably isn't a one-stop shop for all these things. But as a brief overview, I can tell you that federally there are a few things. There's obviously the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is federal law, which is basically a charter that has all of the rights of all individual Canadians enshrined. That includes, the right to be free from the state, the right to be free from illegal search and seizure and illegal detention and whatnot, all your classic legal rights of someone who's an accused person that I would deal with in my job. But it also includes a clause on equality, Section 15, that it specifies certain enumerated analogous groups, disability being one, of which our equality is guaranteed under the Charter, in which we can actually potentially bring legal action against a government for if they're not treating us, quote unquote, equally. So that's on a macro level and on a federal level. And of course, there's the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which deals with federal employers such as banks, chartered banks, and federal government departments, which would deal with those people that work in those jobs, their human rights issues. But on the provincial level, each province has its own Human Rights Commission, including Ontario, and their own Human Rights Code, which may differ slightly. So in Ontario, on a provincial level, we have, of course, the Ontario Human Rights Code, which governs individual human rights, say at school or in the workplace or employment, etc. And then, of course, we have the AODA, which has been enforced now since 2005. And that covers a broad spectrum of kind of all life in Ontario, from businesses to government. That's a more of a societal, systemic level, whereas I think the Human Rights Commission is more of an individual level. So that's a broad brush of what we have available in terms of human rights law in Ontario. But I don't know of any one-stop shop other than the Know Your Rights project, where you could kind of get a sense of that all in one place.
How do we necessarily know what our accommodation should be? I mean, for me, I know that I need large fonts. Things are becoming less and less paperless, so I really rely on digital formats, and I love Apple technology because of their accessible features and their font enlargement and contrast and things like that. But how do we kind of figure out what the right accommodations for us are? And I know that's a pretty unique question. And then from that, so the second fold of this would be, how do we start asking for those accommodations, whether it be at school, at work, or in public services?
So if I could just do a quick plug just from our leftover from our last question, I should have mentioned ARCH, which is a disability law clinic I happen to be board of directors of. They've got some great online resources in terms of fact sheets and kind of how to go about doing a human rights complaint and whatnot. And they're a free legal clinic where everyone's entitled to, I believe, at least a half an hour of free consultation. So that's also a great place to start in terms of their resources online and their staff lawyers.
If you guys missed that, we'll share that link in the description for ARCH. So you'll be able to access that in the description or somewhere surrounding this piece of information. So sorry, go ahead, Jason.
Sorry, so I just want to get that plug in. I think it's important that that's another great resource for people to start that has information that you would need. And it's done in a very readable way. It's not done in like legalese. It's done in like plain language, which is also very important even for lawyers. It's obviously, you can say something in 4 words instead of 40 words. It's obviously going to be better and clearer. In terms of knowing one's accommodation, it's very individual, as both of you have said. Somebody with partial vision will have different needs than somebody with no vision, for example. So it's really a lot of trial and error on the individual's part to see what works for them. And then once they know what that is, to advocate for it. So for example, for me, we've mentioned obviously the cell phone. I think that the Apple products are tremendous in terms of the voiceover mode and whatnot. I've recently been struggling with learning Microsoft Teams for a course I'm taking at work. I'm using it on the computer, but after downloading it onto my iPhone, it's actually a lot more accessible and a lot easier to figure out. Not perfect, but comparatively speaking, better than on the desktop.
Right.
So the phones have really, and I have a work iPhone and I have a personal iPhone, and the phones have really brought us a long way in the last couple of years. But it's very individual. For example, for me that has no vision, a large print program doesn't work for me. So I need to have a program with speech access. I need to have something where I can scan documents to get them in speech. I would need something that accommodates I'm not really a Braille user, but if I was, I might need a Braille display, for example. So I think it's the person has to try to see what they can put in their toolkit, and the individual has to do some trial and error to see what works. And then once we know what works in a school setting or a work setting, we have to say, I've done my homework. Here's my needs. Here's why I need them. And here's why you have to provide it for me. So I think it's first on us to figure out what works for us. And that there's not a one size fits all solution. It's very individual. And then once we kind of experiment with our own situation, then we have to advocate those needs to our employer, school, whatever, to make sure that we're properly accommodated.
Yeah, I think that totally that makes sense to me. I know that I've gone through that process myself, but for somebody who is, maybe was recently diagnosed or has yet to really hone in on the resources that they need, or is just kind of almost there, whether it be in an educational setting or an employment setting, I think packaging, you mentioned kind of saying, here's what I need and why I need it. I think maybe can be a little daunting for some people, especially starting a new job or starting, at a school where they don't know people. I know that it's challenging. I've come across it myself of being unsure as to how to properly request those accommodations. Now, Avesta, I know that you're just starting an articling job and finished school. How did you go about, putting together that packet of requests for the accommodations that you need to succeed?
Right. So I completely agree that it's definitely an individual package, and you have to know what works best for yourself. But I do want to say it doesn't necessarily have to be an isolated process to know that. I know the CNIB has a lot of different programs where you can come together and play with technology with other people in the community. And growing up, one of the big milestones for me was for most of my like beginning education after I was diagnosed, I sort of tried to hide the fact that I was visually impaired. And so I isolated myself from a lot of other people that may have had similar experiences to me. And that was a little bit of a detriment to myself because they didn't really know what accommodations were out there and how it could help me. So going to those things, and my first time going to one of them was at the Lake Joe camp. So I think if you're definitely younger or a high schooler, that's something you want to consider because you learn a lot and you learn from others. And that's actually a philosophy that I've written in my book too, that through others, you can actually learn a lot more about yourself as an individual. So I definitely think that though it's an individualized package and you have to know the accommodations that work best from you, it's not an isolated process. You can definitely do it while working with others. And so the CNIB is the best place to start for that, especially for youth and also older people as well. So I just wanted to throw that in there so that that part isn't as daunting. But also don't feel like you have to get the accommodations that are assumed like upon you. So I do have some vision. And if somebody just saw me, they'd probably think that I'd be able to read large print just on how I behave and how much I can see. But actually, I prefer the audio because like it's just too much text and it'll give me a headache. So like those kind of things you have to figure out for yourself and sort of don't feel like you have to be put in this box of what accommodations, people think you should be having. So again, definitely be willing to experiment in different accommodations and see what works best for you. And that said, once you kind of know what works best for you and you've got your little package going, I think you definitely want to be able to present it in a way that it's almost empowering, I would say. Like, these things that, I might have challenges, but here's a way I can overcome it. So to somebody who hears it kind of seems like an empowering and sort of like more like a relaxing sort of message to them that, like I know a way that I can help this person and they can be the best that they can be at my work or my institution, instead of like saying, well, I have challenges with all these things, but I have no idea how to help, what to do to accommodate myself. Please help me. That I feel like would be a little bit more daunting. So I would say that the package to a lot of people may be daunting for you to present, but maybe if you think about the mindset that it's actually easing the person who hears it, that might be a little bit easier to kind of push you to bring it forward. And I would say that also once you do have your package going, don't be like, definitely stand by it. But if there's something that is presented to you that it's almost the same thing, let's say, but comes under a different name, but does the exact same thing, try to be a little bit like just like with your peers and how you're able to try different things and see what works for you. If this is something that could possibly work for you, try it. And if it doesn't work out, then go back to your original package. But if it does, then be a little bit flexible if you can, but not to the point where it's like a completely different thing that's being presented to you and that's not going to work based off experience. So you got to have your sort of judgment calls and be able to, again, knowing your rights is a lot about knowing yourself. So know what works for you and where you can kind of be flexible and where you can't.
I 100% agree with that. And I'm going to do something that I haven't done on this series yet, because I think it ties in exactly to what both Jason and Vesta have been talking about here. Is, as some of you may know, I'm currently in the process of a human rights dispute. And that came from me requesting accommodations to write an examination, a professional examination, and being denied and offered accommodations that did not fit my needs whatsoever. And it was a really challenging letter to receive. our email, I guess at this point, to say that we're not going to give you what you've always been accommodated with in the past and what has proven to be a successful accommodation packet for you. We're going to give you what other people, and these are their words, other blind people have used and been successful with, and given your disability, you're going to have to use those as well. Otherwise, you're on your own here. And I think the reality is a lot of us have experienced one form of that or another. And I've been, I don't want to say guilty of this, but I've succumbed to that pressure of giving in, of saying, okay, I'll try it your way, and not being successful and feeling that I was denied a fair shot at success. So I have stood up against that and am fighting for a systemic change within that institution, and hoping that that will have residual effects amongst a larger scope. But I wanted to share that because I wanted to really humanize this conversation for everybody listening, watching, participating, that it's okay to say no. If you understand that your chances at success or your rights as somebody with difference, and as an individual, we're all different, aren't being fulfilled. And it's really hard to advocate for yourself because, especially in a large institution, how do you go about making change or creating change for yourself to start with? And I love the know yourself aspect. You really need to know yourself to know what your rights are. And I guess that comes into, a large topic that we tend to bring up almost on every episode of what are reasonable accommodations. And I know that we're going to bring up the duty to accommodate and undue hardship. So Jason, would you mind just kind of giving our viewers a brief definition of what undue hardship is and duty to accommodate?
So sure, I'll give you a kind of a 30,000 foot view. So this is all spelled out in the Ontario Human Rights Code for those of us who are in Ontario. I'm sure each province has their own version of it. So basically what it says is that every entity in Ontario, be that an employer, a school, a store, any sort of public entity that's regulated through the laws of Ontario, has a duty to accommodate anybody with a disability, whether that be someone who's a customer, a student, an employee, etc. And so they have to provide what's called reasonable accommodation to the point of undue hardship. Undue hardship is a legal term, but it's not precisely defined. It basically means that the entity has to, or the business or whatever, has to accommodate that person to the point of basically almost they'd have to show that to accommodate this person basically is going to almost like bankrupt the company. Like it's going to be so much of a drain on resources that the company wouldn't survive, or there'd be a risk to health and safety of other people in the company or something. It's a very high hurdle. Basically, it has to be something that would interfere substantially with their business to do the accommodation. And that's very hard to show, especially if you're in government or in a post-secondary institution. So there is this legal duty to accommodate to the point of basically having your business shut down, almost undue hardship. So it's a very broad duty to accommodate, and to show undue hardship is a pretty high bar, which gives us as people with disabilities a lot of runway and leeway to advocate for our own individual needs and not accept something that's being imposed on us or kind of shoved down our throat because it's convenient for them. No, it has to be that it has to work for us, and they have to do it unless it's going to basically cripple their business. So that gives us a lot of leeway and a lot of room to move in terms of what our accommodations and needs are.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to keep reinforcing the importance of really understanding from breaking it down to a point where everybody can understand. Undue hardship has been reiterated on this series so many times, and hearing the definition I don't know, it just really kind of instills the leverage we have to make sure that we are accommodating and that the duty to accommodate people with difference to be as successful as possible is crucial. And it's really being put forward that it's really important. And I mean, I know that this episode is definitely running long, and there's a ton of topics I would love to cover with you guys. So I guess we can discuss that another time. But I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit about, Jason, how you kind of figured out what were the right accommodations for you with somebody with no sight to go through law school, to know that you needed a paralegal to help you succeed in your career, and what was the kind of journey in requesting those accommodations and advocating for yourself?
So to Vesta's point, it wasn't done in isolation. I think that we always work best when we work with others. But it was a lot of trial and error. So, for example, I had some limited vision before and as I was in law school that I wound up losing in my first couple of years of practice. So there even had to be some accommodations even along the way as I went along. But generally what I would do is I've actually been pretty lucky. So I went to law school at U of T, and they knew I was blind. It was, obviously it was very clear in my application, and it was part of my personal statement, and I certainly didn't have any issue in disclosing it. So they knew I was going to have some accommodation issues. So they actually, when I started going to school there, the staff sat me down and said, what accommodations, what do you need, basically? So it was actually pretty easy. I didn't have to really force my way in. They kind of offered it to me. So, and I thought, well, okay, in the business back in, 1998, and there still was an actual library at that time, which is basically now just a bunch of computer terminals. But at the time, there still were the classic, stacks of books. So I'm like, well, there's a lot of research projects here, and it's a very, very daunting library. I'm going to need someone to help me do my research in the library. And so done. And I knew from undergrad I needed a PC with a speech program called JAWS for Windows. Done. I also knew I needed some way to get printed documents, documents on paper into electronic format. So I was able to ask for a scanner. So it was kind of that process where they asked me what I needed, and I told them, and I explained why I needed it and how it would help me. And I didn't really get any pushback. So I was very lucky in that sense. I guess being my disability is very obvious. I didn't have to sell people on me being disabled, where some folks that maybe have some partial vision, it looks like they can see better than they can, may have more of a hurdle, whereas with me, it was pretty obvious. So I didn't have I didn't have to prove my disability. It was very obvious. So I just had to basically articulate as to what my accommodations were. And once I finished law school and had no vision and started working, so I worked at my current job as a summer student for 2 summers where I didn't have a full-time assistant. And it became very clear that I was going to need one because of the level of just printed material to wade through. And then when you're doing criminal law and you're doing docket courts, for example, and there's documents coming at you all the time that are new. A person just got arrested and they're being processed and being brought to the court to have their bail hearing. So you don't have time to get those documents transcribed in alternative format. They're coming at you in real time. And the only real accommodation is to have someone there with you to wade through them. And that's kind of where we figured out, actually, I would need an assistant to help me doing things like docket court, where you got all these written documents on the fly, where you're making decisions on them and dealing with lawyers. So as I started my job, it became very clear that it would be there were some accommodation issues and I would need to resolve them. And then, so I worked with my HR people and my managers to come up with a solution. And that was to have a full-time paralegal dedicated to me and my accommodations. And when I go to court, especially now as I'm a more senior lawyer, I'm part of the training program, whereas I bring a student or a young lawyer with me and they can help me with making sure that I can read things that are, let's say that the other side, drops 10 cases on us 5 minutes before court. I can at least deal with them because I've got someone there with me, where it would be really hard if I didn't. So I'm lucky that I work for an employer that's very into accommodation and really gives me what I need. But I know not everyone's that fortunate. But really for me, it was a lot of trial and error, and I would try things that are hard to do, and then I would find a workaround. It's all about really finding workarounds. There's always more than one way to do things. It's just finding that way to do it.
That's something I really live by in my professional capacity. As a partner in a business kind of creation company, is always multiple ways to get to point A to B. And just because a straight line is the fastest doesn't mean it's the most effective. But if you can still get there, your journey along the way may yield amazing results that, taking the straight and narrow path might not have provided. So I think that's a really key takeaway. And thank you for sharing that. I know that it really helps kind of bring this into a really real scope for our viewers and listeners here. And just one quick follow-up question with that. As technology evolves, you mentioned that you have a work iPhone as well as a personal one. What's the kind of request process? If something comes along that's going to make your job easier for you to do, is it a formal application that you have to submit, or is it just reaching out to your HR department and saying, hey, I would really need this to help me do X? Well, what's that process like?
That'll depend on where you work. For me, for the federal government, it's pretty easy. We have a centralized accommodation office in Ottawa, and we go directly through them, and they'll work with us to find the proper accommodation. And then basically from that point, we get sign off from our manager, which for me is no problem. I guess I'm lucky in that, again, I've been at my job for so long now that I think I'm trusted, so that if I say something, I need something, it's not really questioned. But I know that's harder for someone who's just starting out. Someone, for say, in Avesta's situation where she's starting articling and she's not a known commodity there, it may be a little bit more difficult because you got to get known. For me now, I've been doing this so long that it's kind of like if I say I need it, I pretty much get it, unless, again, and it's pretty hard for a federal government department to claim undue hardship. We can't get you this laptop because it might bring the department down. I mean, it's pretty hard to make that claim if you're in government. Maybe different if you're in more of a small business situation, but when you're working in governments and large corporations, it's pretty hard to say, getting you this computer is going to bankrupt us. It's hard to say that. So my process is sort of formal in the way that I have to go through the accommodation folks in Ottawa, but then I have to get sign off from my manager, which is all pretty much, I don't want to say it's academic, but it's fairly easy to do. And I don't have to really go through too many hurdles to do it. But, that process in itself has evolved over the last 17 years. It wasn't always that way. It used to be more red tape, and fortunately the red tape has been cut down for me personally. For people, it's not that easy, and they have to really prove themselves. They have to prove A, they have a disability, and B, it's one that has to be accommodated, and C, why this expense should be undertaken to accommodate them. And that can be much, much more challenging. So it gets into more, here's the tools I need to do my job, and here's why. And so I think for me, it's probably a little bit, I don't want to say it's ever easy, but easier than most have it.
Yeah, it's fantastic that, you're so well accommodated without pushback. And I think my real point of the question is to show people that, things change, and we're in such a high pace of change, especially with the current situation Before we signed on, Jason and I were talking about, using Zoom as just almost like a reflex of conversation at this point where, 12 months ago, it wasn't really something that people would have been comfortable with. So, my point here is don't be afraid to ask, but make sure that it works for you first. These tools, this seems to be the theme, is to really to try things out. There's no harm in trying. I know that there are financial resources and aid that can provide you with financial resources to test things. CNIB is a great resource to start to learn about accessible technologies and resources. There's tons of groups. Jason, it was Arch, you said, was the company that you're on the board for?
Disability Law Center. It's a clinic that's funded primarily through Legal Aid Ontario and some other sources that is a disability law clinic. And so they do test case litigation, but they'll do individual assessments. And they may take on your case. They may refer you somewhere else, but at least it's a great starting point. They've got some great online resources as well in terms of fact sheets and how-tos and legislation. So it's a great complement for the CNIB Know Your Rights program. We actually did a joint workshop back about a year ago now, Arch and CNIB, where we actually put on a workshop for lawyers who want to have visually impaired and clients with sight loss and how they would accommodate them. And it was actually very productive.
That's awesome. I think it's a great resource. I certainly didn't know about that, so I'll be checking that out after this conversation. And it looks like we lost Avesta, but I think she's joining back in now. So just give us one second here while we resync on the technology front. And as soon as Avesta kind of rejoins the call, I'd really like her to share some insight about the book that she's written. I think the topic itself is so empowering, and the pivots in terminology are really key to understanding and reframing how we consider difference, whether it be physical, emotional, invisible, visible. All of those things really are important to consider. And as somebody who has an invisible, visible difference. And that complicated way to say is, as Avesta's mentioned in this episode, is most people don't initially view me as somebody with vision loss. And there's always a hurdle or that kind of second where people have to calibrate in their mind that, oh, he can't see, or I forgot he might not be able to read the menu at this restaurant, whatever it may be. I've been on client lunches where I've taken out my phone and used it as a magnifying glass and, had to explain that. And it's just, not that it was an issue, but there are these little tiny things that, always need to be considered. So I think with that said, Jason, is there any advice that you could give our listeners, our viewers, in terms of advocating for themselves, or any inspiration to kind of send people off with?
Well, I think, and advocacy isn't necessarily actually going and arguing in front of a formal tribunal. It could just be education. What we're doing right now is advocacy. It's self-empowerment. So I think what people can do is really educate themselves to what their rights are, and they can do that by watching this podcast, going to the CNIB website, going to the Arch website, talking to people, and so kind of experimenting for themselves what accommodation they need. And then a lot of it's about the education. And I think we've actually got a real opportunity here right now. I think the one positive thing that's happened over the last, say, 6 months with the pandemic is I think it's made the world in some ways less accessible, in some ways more accessible. And I say this because working from home now is the norm. And I think that's going to be here to stay. I think that my office, 6 months ago, being that we're litigators, working from home was almost unheard of. You can't do it. You got to be in court every day. You have to be in the office. You need to be, and there are things you have to be in the office for. That's true, but there's a lot of things that you don't. Like a lot of courts now are being run remotely through Zoom or through other platforms. I've set up my summer office on my balcony in my condo. So I mean, and there's actually been some stats that people are actually working longer days now, working from home because you're not commuting. You're not going out for lunch for an hour and a half. And you're spending less money every day because you're not blowing money on $20 lunches. So in some ways, it's become more accommodating that someone doesn't have to worry about getting to an office or getting home or getting on transportation and much of what's happening is being done electronically on formats that are more or less accessible, like Zoom. So I think that the pandemic has actually created an opportunity, although there's some challenges with it, of course, in terms of getting around and social distancing. There are some advantages in that working from home, I think, is now the norm, and working from the office will be the exception. So I think that creates more opportunity for people with disabilities that perhaps would have had challenges getting in and getting around to an office or commuting or accessing transportation, can work from home on more or less accessible platforms like Zoom, which I find for the most part very accessible. So there's opportunities there too.
Yeah, I think it's it's really well said, and it feels like everybody's trying to accommodate in one way, shape, or form these days. Whether it's accommodating a meeting, because they have to drop watch their kids from X, Y, and Z time, but it really, I think, is paving the way to change in terms of getting people what they need to succeed, whether it's with any type of difference, so to say, or not. And I think it's a really exciting time to advocate for change, to be able to really understand what we need as individuals, generally speaking, to succeed and live a life that has meaning, that gives us joy and purpose in our day-to-day lives. Jason, I really wanted to thank you so much for the time to speak with me this morning and to be part of this series. The information and motivation that you've given myself and I'm sure other people to advocate and to succeed and to make it a priority. To get what you need to be successful, and it really goes a long way. So, thank you so much for joining. I'll be sure to add the ARCH information in the description or comments or wherever it may live in perpetuity on the internet, so that people can access that information. I know I'll be sure to check it out after this call. And guys, if you need, have any questions, comments, anything about this episode or human rights, you can always reach out to the CNIB, as they would be more than happy to help point you in the direction you need. Okay, so we're actually back on a different day. We had some technical difficulties getting Avesta joined for the rest of the conversation, so please ignore any continuity issues. But I'm back here, and to kind of segue back into the conversation, we were talking about terminology and how that makes such a big difference. And Avesta, you've written a book called Diffability. And I think that's such an interesting choice of words there. So would you mind sharing with our listeners and viewers a little bit about the book, what drew you to it? And I'm really interested in how you kind of coined that term, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. So the book sort of began when I was inspired um, by sort of going into the roots of the ideology behind disability, because at least from my experience in life, it always felt that people always took it as a given that you lost some sort of ability or um, some sort of innate part of that you should have had. And so it was more about okay, so how can we sort of accommodate and start a discussion about like compensating for that part or accommodating that part um, that you've lost. And so I found that a very interesting uh, discrepancy because I didn't hear that much discussion about where that original idea that we have lost or we don't have something that is quote unquote normal or that we should have had sort of became. And that's when throughout my first degree, I studied a lot of philosophy. And there's a lot of philosophers who sort of talked about different um, relations between whether it was gender studies or race studies between the differences that we feel towards one another. And so they kind of inspired me to think about disability a different way too. Like, where did this idea come from and how accurate is it? And I feel that it's for a lot of the prejudice or stigma or hard times that somebody who identifies as having a disability faces usually comes from this idea that we've lost something or we can't do something, and that becomes internalized by the community and then becomes then internalized by the person. And so it makes it a really hard upward battle to try to build yourself back up to that point of confidence. So, Diffability, the book, is about trying to reformulate that ideology and trying to bring back a different perspective as to what identifies us and what ability really means. Because it's not that we can't do something, and so we do it differently, and sort of bringing back appreciation for diversity, um, both to the community and to the individual. And I think that, in my personal opinion, that once you start sort of chipping away at that traditional ideology and bringing a different way of thinking about it, it helps alleviate a lot of the structural and social stress for people who identify as being disabled, if you will, and sort of helps them bring out their potential a little bit easier.
I really love that. I think it's something that, I mean, you've really nailed it in terms of, you know, differentiating, disability as something to regain, to get back to, a status quo, if you will. And I mean, a term that I use here very intentionally a lot to describe individuals is not, people with disabilities, but with visible and invisible difference. So, I mean, that was something that I really, even when we were doing this a few weeks ago, was excited to hear kind of your description about this. And how did you kind of get the idea to write a book about this? Being a student, a philosophy student, and now an articling law student, where did this kind of concept of a book come from?
I think a book uh, hold a special place to me for a lot of different reasons. I think, first of all, it's something that you can kind of see the beginning structural point of it and have like a final product of sort of what your idea became. And it's a book is a very interesting platform because it's sort of a collection of words that first formulated in your mind and now it's on paper or ebook version, if you will, but it's a very interesting way of communication, and it's uh, almost makes you feel a little vulnerable that like people are kind of reading into these ideas that you've worked and thought about for so long, um, without like you being directly communicating. So it's a very interesting platform, and when I was younger, I really loved books and I read a lot, and I think it's a very very powerful way of collecting knowledge and sharing ideas because it preserves so well and it distributes so well, and um, you can come back to it and you can preserve it, and I think you can like expand on it too, so that's why I chose a book.
Yeah, no, I really love it, and I think to tie into this whole topic of self advocacy, a unique way of advocating, not only for yourself, but I presume others. I haven't read the book, but based on our conversations, I'm I guess I would be assuming that you did this also to inspire others to advocate for themselves and to foster change within their communities. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, so very essential theme to the book that sort of ties in to self advocacy or advocacy as a whole is this whole theme of Hegel's, who's a very famous philosopher's concept of the other. And so, what the other is that we can only know ourselves by knowing each other and knowing each other's differences, and then based on each other's differences, we know more about ourselves. So, for example, a woman wouldn't know she's a woman unless she saw a man, because then she would know that there's a difference. And then a man wouldn't, or an old person wouldn't know they're old until they saw a young person. And so it kind of brings back to the fact that self advocacy is very important. And it's not just for yourself, but you're actually doing the community a service too. Because the more diversity and inclusion you have in a community, in a society, an institution, or wherever or whatever collective you have, the more self appreciation uh, spreads, not just for the person who's advocating, but for the people that are around you. More enlightenment. So, I think that's a really important thing to remember.
Yeah, no, I think that's so well said, and I see your philosophy coming out right there. I love the quotation and the citation. So, Avesta, do you have any kind of thoughts or comments that you'd like to leave our listeners and viewers with? Any kind of words of wisdom, inspiration, or anything that other people can do to help inspire and foster change within the community?
Well, I think it's important to first of all know yourself. Don't afraid to be yourself, and don't afraid to speak up for yourself. Know your rights, know your responsibilities, and try to build those relationships. And don't sway away from fostering relationships or going after your goals because um, you feel that there may be challenges along the way. Don't count yourself out, and don't let people count you out for reasons that can be accommodated and should be accommodated. I would say, when possible, take the collaborative approach. But if that doesn't work, then it's always important to know your rights and bring them to the table because you're not just you're going to be doing it for yourself, but you're also influencing and inspiring those around you. So never be afraid to do that.
Well said. And if any of our listeners or viewers want to get a copy of your book, where can they do that?
So there is a print version and an ebook version, and you can find them on Amazon or Google Play or Kindle or Nookbook or the Friesen Press publishing website or iTunes are just some of the places.
Sounds like a major, all the major kind of platforms. We'll put some links in the description or have access to them. So if you are interested in reading and picking up a copy of Avesta's book, which I highly recommend, please check that out in the links below.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Guys, till next time, we'll see you then.
For more CNIB Foundation podcasts, visit cnib.ca/podcasts.